Why don't we come to order? I've got myself a gavel now. Y'all were so unruly last time, so I've got an old gavel. So we call the meeting of the Pension Retirement Reform Task Force together and want to welcome everybody. We really are trying to make this a transparent and open process, so we're grateful for everyone being here. Why don't we go around the room or the table for the task force and introduce ourselves, and let's start with Carl Cannon.
Carl Cannon, member of the task force.
Sherry McGill, member of the task force.
John Wildanks, member of the task force.
Glenn Yates, member of the task force.
John Thompson, member of the task force.
Bill Shy.
Bob Shercliffe, task force member.
Charlie Appleby, task force member.
Chester Akins, task force member.
Kelly O'Leary, task force member.
Thank you very much. Y'all will remember at our called meeting on Monday, we had a presentation from the Pew Charitable Trust and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and MAVA LLC. And one of our first tasks today, y'all have heard that, and I would entertain a motion. I got the sense that y'all did join with me very enthusiastically and wanted to invite Pew and Arnold here along with MAVA. I think that's a derivative of Pew to help us with our efforts over the next few months. So if someone would like to make that motion, I would entertain it. There's a motion. Is there a second? Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed. So David Drain from the Pew, if you would come up here, I have written and we have considered this invitation, which sets forth the general scope of the work, and we're delighted that y'all will come, Pew and Arnold, and we're just looking forward to working with y'all and solving this pension issue. Thank you. Great. Thank you. This is an exciting day for Jacksonville. Y'all have had delivered to you binders with the original distributed information from our original meeting, plus some additional information that has come in since. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that information is now available to you. I've got some more information to distribute later. Right now, what we want to do is hear from Chris Hand, who's the mayor's chief of staff. The original, the current pension status is in the binder. The original mayor's proposal and the Civic Council, the original letter and the current proposal from the Civic Council are all in the binder. So Chris is not going to rehash the proposal, but he's going to share with you some additional ideas that they want to bring before you. Chris.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you all of you for your service. This is such a critical issue, is Mayor Brown's top priority, and we're just so lucky that all of you have come together to try and help forge a community consensus on this issue. A couple of things that I wanted to just sort of raise to your attention. First of all, have gotten a couple of questions about legislation that might be pending before City Council on Tuesday night. I'm not going to speak to that because obviously the mayor's office is not the author of that, but there is a bill that's been proposed to transfer a number of city assets to the Police and Fire Pension Fund. We haven't been involved in that, so I'm not familiar with whatever assessments or studies or reviews of that. That's been a suggestion that's been out there for years, but I did want to alert you to the fact that that legislation is out there. What our recommendation as a mayor's office would be for this task force to vet all of those types of issues that might deal with our pension unfunded liability and how we might rectify that. But I did just want to bring that to the attention of the task force. That legislation's out there. I believe it's sponsored by Councilman Schellenberg, who's asked that it be handled on an emergency basis on Tuesday night. I believe Council President Gulliford has said that he does not support doing it as an emergency. He'd rather have it handled by the task force, vetted and reviewed by the task force. But I did just want to bring that to your attention since there has been some pension news in the last couple of days. What I wanted to do today, and our office is bringing a couple extra copies, is just sort of frame up for you kind of very briefly where we've been on this issue and just to help sort of think through where we might be going on this in terms of the overall community effort to deal with pension reform. I've sort of crunched. There is a larger PowerPoint presentation in your binder that I went through with the initial members of the committee on July 10th. I'm not going to rehash that today in the interest of being efficient with the use of your time. But I did want to sort of point out a few key issues that I think it's important that everyone have the same body of knowledge as we go forward, a little bit about where we've been. First thing is sort of talk about what the city's pension challenge is, what ultimately launched us and launched Mayor Brown into this effort to kind of help deal with one of the most serious financial challenges the city's faced in many years. The first slide you'll see is just how large the increase in the city's annual contribution to the Police and Fire Pension Fund has been in recent years. In fiscal year 2001-2002, our contribution was just under $10 million. As you know, the contribution that's in the budget that's pending before City Council on Tuesday night is $148 million. So you're talking about, and actually that increase is even higher than 1,125% because of this year's figure that's been added, but an over 1,000% increase in the city's PFPF contribution in a relatively short period of time. So that's one of the challenges that brought us to this issue. The second one is the increasing underfunded status of the Police and Fire Pension Fund. Approximately 10 years ago, the unfunded liability was approximately $400 million. As of October 11, it had grown to about $1.4 billion. The current figure is closer to $1.7 billion based on the 2012 valuation that was just approved by the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board. So between October 03 and the current day, we've gone from about $400 million to nearly $1.7 billion in the unfunded liability of the plan. And I would just posit, if I may, that I think the biggest task that this task force has before it is to look at that unfunded liability challenge and how we kind of get our arms around that going forward. In December 2000, sort of a little more information on the question of underfunding. In December 2012, Summit Strategies, which is the Police and Fire Pension Fund Investment Advisors, issued a report that said that as of 10/1/11, the PF was only 38% funded. I think that's gone up a little bit in the most recent valuation, that it would not exceed 50% funding for another decade, and recommended a variety of remedies, modifying benefits, increasing contributions, and increasing investment returns. So that gives you some sense of kind of where we've been. The other sort of issue I want to point out that has really focused the attention of Mayor Brown and our administration on coming up with a community solution to this issue is the risk to the city's credit rating. I will tell you, in the 2 years that I've been in this job, I've learned more about rating agencies and how critically important they are to a municipality than I ever could have imagined. In July, one of those rating agencies, the Fitch agency, released a report in which they described the city's pension liability as a key credit concern and a threat to credit quality. And in fact, just about 3 weeks ago, Fitch downgraded the city's outlook to negative based on the continued delay in getting retirement reform accomplished. So your presence here, your willingness to participate in this process is extremely timely from a credit rating standpoint for the city. Both, like I said, a subsequent Fitch report and reports from Standard & Poor's, S&P, and Moody's have raised similar concerns about just how important it is for the community to get behind a retirement reform solution. So again, your service on this task force could not be more timely. Just to kind of remind you briefly about how Mayor Brown and our administration got involved in this issue, Mayor Payton and his team, to their great credit, worked very hard on this in the last several years of the administration and sort of laid the foundation with a retirement reform plan that ultimately, like our initial one did not pass City Council. For Mayor Brown and our administration, this work started during the transition into office. Mayor Brown had a pension transition committee that worked and looked at this issue. And once Mayor Brown took office, we began to analyze the Police and Fire Pension Fund and also analyze best practices from around Florida and around the country to determine what sort of initiative we would come up with to kind of help solve this problem. And two experts who I think most of you on the task force have met, but not all of you, particularly the new members, who we turned to. One is Attorney Jim Lynn of the Lewis, Longman, and Walker firm in Tallahassee. Jim is a very humble person, so he would never say this, but I will. He is probably the preeminent municipal pension attorney in the state of Florida, who represents the city of Jacksonville, to be able to advise us on the patchwork of legal requirements that go into implementing changes to the pension system. Also, Robert DeZubi from the Milliman Group. Milliman happens to be the actuaries for the Florida retirement system. They are also the actuaries for the city of Jacksonville when it relates to our analysis of the police and fire pension fund. So we turn to a couple of experts to deal with this. Some of this other material is in your packets as about to how we got to our previous agreement. I don't want to rehash that because you'll be able to read that, but I did want to sort of just sort of highlight very briefly some of the key points of that agreement, not to replay the past because obviously certain things have happened and what's done is done there, but just to give you a sense of where we've been, because obviously you're charged and empowered with determining where we're going in this situation. As you might recall, the agreement that the city reached with the Police and Fire Pension Fund involved major benefit changes for new public safety employees. Had it been passed, it would have applied to any employees hired after October 1, 2013. Current employees would have contributed more both in the short term and in the long term, and it would have involved some significant governance reforms to the Police and Fire Pension Fund. Just to sort of touch a little more, just slightly more deep on a couple of those points. It would have had $1.2 billion in savings, and by savings I mean lowered pension costs than under the status quo. It would have been $1.2 billion in lowered pension costs over a 30-year period. And in fact, that included what would have been $45 million in this coming year's budget and $100 million in lowered pension costs over a 5-year period. Just by comparison, the plan that the previous administration brought forward was about $700 million over 35 years. And those were the savings in the previous agreement, the one that we reached but did not go through City Council, was confirmed not only by the city's actuary but also the Police and Fire Pension Fund's actuary. Also wanted to point out that in that agreement, again, this is just purely for your background information at this point, that it made some of the most significant benefit concessions, or received some of the most significant benefit concessions in the recent history of the state of Florida. Probably the best measure of comparison because 65 of the 67 counties put their employees in the Florida retirement system is the FRS. So you can see on the chart in one of the PowerPoints in your binder and in the one I've given you as well, some pretty significant differences there. Now, it's not exactly the same, and there are some areas where the Florida retirement system remained a little bit more aggressive than the city of Jacksonville. But on some of these key cost drivers that I've laid out, the vesting period, years to retirement, what the benefit accrual rate is, what the employee contribution is, how it deals with drop, and how it deals with Social Security. The City of Jacksonville agreement that, again, was tentative, was not approved, would have been more aggressive than the Florida retirement system. So it had some pretty significant benefit concessions. I say that from the standpoint of one of the principles we would encourage this task force to adopt is as you move forward and look at what is the best community solution going forward, I think it's important not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. As we kind of look at those examples, let's take a close look at those achievements that have already occurred here and figure out how to build on those and lengthen those as we head toward a community solution on this. One of the subjects we'll talk a lot about throughout this process is the assumed rate of return. What does the plan set as its assumed investment return over a period of time? This agreement would have lowered it from what was the current rate, 7.75%, or what was the previous rate, 7.75%, all the way down to 7.25%. As you may know, during the current valuation report, the Police and Fire Pension Fund has already gone ahead and lowered it all the way down to 7.0%. But ours would have done it in a more stair-step approach over a period of time, and we did that because this was part of a comprehensive agreement as opposed to just doing it in one fell swoop. So that's an issue you'll hear a lot about. You will have a PhD level knowledge of actuarial rates of return, I'm sure, by the time this process is finished. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. But I talked about the decreased cost, pension cost, that would have come from this agreement, $1.2 billion over 30 years and $100 million over the next 5. But I think the third number on page 19 of the slide you have in front of you is probably the most important of those three, because it goes down to what the per employee cost of pension benefits is. Under the previous agreement, which of course is not valid, but under the previous agreement, it would have driven the per employee cost from 34% down to 10% and that's a very significant change. The 10% is pretty comparable to what, say, Social Security would be, so a very significant shift for what would have been new employees and how much we were paying toward their retirement. So again, also something from the agreement. I touched earlier on the issue of unfunded liability, which I think we can agree as a community is critical and has to be dealt with. As of the last evaluation study, and by that I mean the one in 2011 I quoted earlier, the number was 38% and not expected to rise above 50% for another decade. And I think I also mentioned in the very last valuation study, 2012, that's gone up a little bit. The funded status of the plan would have gone up to 71% by the end of this agreement's term, which was in 2030. So there would have been a very significant increase there. So just in terms of a benchmark, as you move forward, I wanted you to kind of have access to that information. One issue that sort of came up, and I just sort of wanted to touch on because I know this will come up in the work of the task force going forward. One of the concerns about that prior agreement was the idea that, well, you could save a lot more if you made more major changes to current employees. As you might recall, under this agreement, current employees maintain their current benefits, but would make an increased pension contribution over time tied to restoration of pay cuts they had taken previously. And we were frequently asked the question, why didn't you increase more what current employees were already paying? Well, one issue is this is a subject which requires agreement. And I know you've heard the General Counsel's office and Chairman Shies talked about before. This is not something we can just impose. There are legal requirements and standards here that we have to follow, and there are sort of two sides to this issue and have to be able to reach agreement on anything. But there's also a financial issue, and we presented this back in July to this committee. But at that time, of the police and fire pension funds, 2.4, then 2.4, it's higher now, then 2.4 funded and unfunded liability. So it's total liability. 90%, or 2.2 billion, was tied up either in benefit commitments to current retirees or benefit commitments to current employees that by law could not be changed. That left about 200 million in total actuarial liability, and if you sort of exempt employees who are closer to retirement, that number decreases even more. So just one thing to keep in mind as you're dealing with the current employees issue, that as you're using your experts at the Pew Charitable Trust, and what a great honor and privilege for the city to have that level of support. I think everyone's very excited about it. That would be an issue I would encourage you to ask them about as they're running different scenarios and looking at different proposals, really having a good handle on what each of those actually produce financially. Because at the end of the day, this is really about what sort of benefit can we obtain both for taxpayers and for city employees. And so it's really important to understand the finances of each of these different pieces, not just what the perceptions are, but what the actual finances are. That's something we discovered working through this process and would encourage y'all to do the same. One thing I just wanted to mention, because this relates to what I said at the outset of my presentation regarding Councilman Schellenberg's bill to transfer city real estate assets. In that agreement, we built in some subjects that the parties would continue to study even after the then hoped-for passage of that agreement as a way of further reducing the unfunded liability and saving the city pension costs. One was kind of how we handle the disability plan for PFPF members, whether that should be inside the plan or outside the plan. How we handle the so-called purchase of service requirements. In other words, if you're a corrections officer who's in the corrections plan and now wants to become a police officer in the PFPF, how do we handle that? And then the third is this issue of city real estate. We have recognized from the outset that this could be a tool in reducing the unfunded liability, but it's a tool that requires some very careful study, some very detailed analysis, and some clear mechanisms for making sure that if we do something like that, that the city is protected financially, and its transfer of any assets or its disposal of any assets and its transfer of the proceeds to pay down the unfunded liability is something that's a good deal for taxpayers. So one thing I would urge you in this process is, if that is an option you're going to consider for the helping to accelerate the pay down of the unfunded liability, just some careful analysis of that is very important. Like, for example, I believe in Councilman Schellenberg's bill, the value he would have set on that property is the assessed value as set by the property appraiser. Well, of course, None of us would sell any of our houses at the assessed value. We'd be looking for a higher value there. So it's those kind of questions you've got to work through as you're looking at those kind of issues, and I know you'll do that going forward. The other sort of thing I want to make sure is teed up for the committee. One of the key agreements we got in this overall package were some pretty significant reforms in the police and fire pension fund governance structure. And two in particular I just want to mention. One, it established some selection criteria for any future PFPF executive director. And those are in the binder you've got right now, the specifics on that. But just to have some clear guidelines on when the PFPF board next selects its executive director, key qualifications they'd have to look at in hiring somebody as they go forward. It also provided selection criteria for the fifth member of the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board. As many of you know, right now, the way that board is constituted is City Council has 2 appointments to the board, police officers have 1 appointment, and firefighters have 1 appointment. Those 4 members, in turn, select the 5th member. Last year, City Council forwarded to the state legislature a local bill or a J bill that would have given that 5th appointee to the City Council as opposed to the other 4. That did not pass last session, so what we had worked out in this agreement were some selection criteria for the 5th member, for the other 4 members to use in making that appointment, that highlighted fiduciary experience, corporate board experience, governance experience along those lines. So again, wanted to just make sure that entire category was teed up for the task force as well, because I do think it's important that you look at that issue also. Finally, the last page of the report, I just want to mention something regarding the Florida retirement system. And I want to make very clear in doing this that I am not in any way endorsing this, recommending it, or suggesting it, but sort of based on a couple of questions we've received, I wanted to present to you an option you may wish to consider and have the Pew people consider as well. Again, not endorsing it. This is not a recommendation from the mayor's office, but merely a request to provide this information, responding to a request to provide this information to the committee. Several folks have suggested that the task force might want to look at the option of having the city join the Florida retirement system. As I mentioned earlier, 65 of the 67 Florida counties have their employees in the Florida retirement system. That provides some continuity statewide. As those who have sort of advocated for that option have indicated, it's a well-regarded, very well-funded retirement system that would more or less put us on the same footing as the other 67 counties. The drawbacks that have been presented to us that I'm forwarding to you are that obviously if you join that system, there's a loss of some control in the ability to handle your retirement costs, because a lot of those decisions are driven from Tallahassee, and we don't know yet what the financial impact of that would be going forward. But it is an option we considered as we were doing our administration analysis of the retirement reform issue, one that we ultimately did not embrace for a number of reasons. One being that there would be an outstanding question as to how we handle the $1.7 billion in unfunded actuarial liability if we were to freeze the current plan and have new employees move into the Florida retirement system. Of course, something that would require agreement by both sides. But given that we've gotten sort of a number of people saying to us, is that something the city ever considered? I wanted to make sure to bring that to your attention, because it might be something in that myriad of options that you're going to consider as we move forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions, but just wanted to give that overview and help frame up the issues for the task force.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions? Anybody?
What are any estimates of the costs around the FRS? I've noticed it as a drawback, but what was it?
And the drawback is not really so much what the costs are. We just don't know what they are, Mr. Wilbanks. We haven't run those yet. It may be something your actuaries want to do. We know what the benefits of that plan are, and probably worth some further discussion.
I might just say, John, that I've met with the Pew folks this morning, and we've been talking about it, and they already know that when you, from their previous experience, that when you convert, if you're going to transfer that unfunded liability to the state, they're going to put a premium on it because they don't want the risk. So there's some definite financial issues there.
Sure.
But that is something that Pew is prepared and will analyze, and as one of the many things they'll be doing for us. So, John, do you have a question?
I had a couple of questions. One was, you mentioned some of the legal limitations around negotiations, and I wondered if you might be able to describe that for for the task force?
Sure. Well, two principal sort of legal issues I would, and while I am a lawyer, I'm not operating one as at the city of Jacksonville. So with that caveat, just two things I'll put on your radar screen. One is what I mentioned earlier, that under Florida law, you cannot take away benefits that either current retirees have earned. So if someone's in retirement, their benefit package is done, or that current employees have already earned. And once someone, in the case of police and fire, has crossed the retirement threshold, which is currently 20 years, their actual benefits are fixed going forward at that point. So very important to keep that in mind. The other piece, and which I know will be a subject of further discussion, Chairman Shai has raised it, has been the 30-year agreement. And I don't want to over-comment on that because the city is currently engaged in litigation with some individual police officers and firefighters on that issue. But the city right now is party to an agreement that was signed in 2001 under the Delaney administration, which has a term through 2030, which establishes the structure and amount of benefits for police officers and firefighters. That's an agreement with the Police and Fire Fund that's been amended several times in the years since then. So when I refer to those legal sort of frameworks that exist in this case, one is dictated by Florida law, the other is by an agreement the city is party to that is currently in place, but is also the subject of litigation.
And so as the city negotiates with the police and fire pension fund, then that agreement may or may not be changed based on what the police and fire pension fund, agrees to in a change. Is that how that operates?
Well, it has not been set in stone. It has changed over time based on agreement between the two parties. I will tell you from an administration standpoint, our view right now is we're just very excited about the work of the task force, and we're going to be looking to the task force for your analysis and ultimately your recommendations as we move forward. So this process is very important to us. Obviously, there are some parallel legal processes involved, and I don't want to get too deep into those because of the nature of them, but we're just very much looking forward to the recommendations of this task force.
And John, I want to talk about that a little bit later, but that is item C1 in your binder, and that is a very critical agreement. It really is, as you know from the transition committee.
I also wanted to ask you about the changes in selection criteria for the executive director of the Police and Fire Pension Fund, and why that was so important in changing.
Well, it was really an effort to just sort of looking for, Mr. Keene has provided many years of service to the Police and Fire Pension Fund, but at some point in the future, he's going to have a successor. And the sole goal with that was to say that when a successor is hired, it makes sense and is important from a fiduciary standpoint, which is what the Police and Fire Pension Fund is all about, to have clear selection criteria that touches on such matters as pension governance, prior management of a police and fire or a public pension fund, certain educational or experience requirements. So the idea was just to have those in place. And the other key criterion there, Mr. Thompson, was to have an executive search firm running that process. That's very consistent with what other independent authorities and boards do here at the city. Obviously, several of our independent authorities have recently gone through that and selecting new leadership. So we felt it was important to have some consistency there and just a clear sense moving forward of what that would look like in the future. It's all about future planning and trying to maximize the fiduciary activity.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
All of this, I want to reiterate, this is our fact-gathering stage. The Pew folks are here. They will be listening, that they are already crunching numbers. They're also already looking at the legality issues. They are prepared and want to meet with beyond the task force, so they'll be meeting with city folks, with the Pension and Fire Trust Board folks, hopefully with union leaders, the sheriff and the fire chief, so that they get a full picture, so that when they report, they will truly be fact-driven and can give us a very nonpartisan, fact-driven report. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you, members.
You all have heard before from the chairman of the Civic Council at our first meeting, and I asked Mr. Halverson if he'd come back and explain for you the nuts and bolts of their latest proposal. Again, this is something that has already been delivered to Pew. They will want to be sitting down with him. we have added to the task force David Boer, who was part of that intimate group that worked on the proposal. So, Steve, we are glad that you're here and would invite you to make a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. Happy to be back here joining you on behalf of the Jacksonville Civic Council, and I particularly commend the addition of David Boer to your group. We had a chance to work with him as a participant in our Civic Council task force, and I'm going to give you a report that in significant measure reflects some of his intellectual work product. So if anything I say today he disagrees with when he joins, listen to him, because he's smarter than I am, and he's almost certainly more correct than I will be. You've gone through a lot, you've heard a lot, so I'll try to get through this presentation with reasonable dispatch here, but feel free to stop me anytime if I go too fast or am not clear in what I'm trying to convey. Starting off, and I think you have a copy of the slide deck. We don't have technology here, so I'll just walk through this as Mr. Hand likewise did. First, by way of some quick recap of background, the Civic Council has been engaged in thinking about pension reform since its inception in 2010, but it in particular became actively engaged after the mediated settlement proposal was put forth, and we evaluated that and tried to proffer our thoughts on it, and did so by letter dated June 20th, addressed to the mayor and to the city council president. And we recognized and commended the city for some significant improvements that were contained within that, but ultimately concluded that the MSP, the mediated settlement proposal, did not go far enough and ought be rejected. It was not a sufficiently complete solution. This task force, of course, was formed on July 3rd, and we commended that effort and pledge, as I do now, to work collaboratively and cooperatively with you to proffer ideas for the benefit of our community. On the 23rd, the City Council, as you know, did vote to reject the MSP, and the Civic Council went to work essentially immediately thereafter to try to construct a different idea, really a framework of not a prescriptive solution as such, but a framework around which a good solution, we think a better solution, might be achieved. In doing that, and the next slide indicates we reiterated and restated the guiding principles that guided our first work, and they are four. First, whatever the solution is, it must be affordable to the city, something that makes sense that we can afford as a city, as a community for the long term. Second, it needs to be a long-term agreement. There is no point to having a short-term fix of any kind. Many cities have done that. This city ought resist that and ought think comprehensively and of a long-term solution to this issue. Third, we believe that the right solution will rest somewhere in the zone of shared sacrifice. We think that everybody is going to have to participate in some fashion in the ultimate solution that includes taxpayers and includes pension beneficiaries, both present and future. And lastly, we think it's important that whatever the solution is, it is both competitive and fair. Any enterprise, cities are no different, must provide competitive compensation if it's going to have top talent, and it must be fair to those people, or it won't long survive as a credible, viable entity. So those are subjective measurements, but it's clearly one of the four principles that must be observed in our judgment to create the right solution. The next slide outlines, in summary form, the critical deficiencies of the mediated settlement proposal. And I say deficiencies with full respect for the difficulty of negotiating anything. It's and everybody in this room has been in negotiations. Easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and a critic from the outside if you're not on the field or at the table. So I say that with a great measure of respect for the hard work that went into the MSP that I said did many good things. But four things it did not do that we think ought to be addressed and are critical. First, Mr. Hand spoke to the actual rate of return. We think it is better as it was made better. It needs to be made better, lower still. That reflects a judgment about risk. It reflects a judgment about what the city its capacity to make long-term, 30-year, 40-year guarantees of pension benefits, and what a sensible conservative long-term return expectation might be, we think it ought to be no higher than 7%, 7.0%. The Police and Fire Pension Fund voted to reach that same number, quite independent of our work. We commend that, and we think that ought to remain the operating assumption. It ought not be higher. To be sure, that adds cost, makes the problem larger in terms of current funding, but it reflects the right framework and prudent fiscal strategy for the city. Second, we noted that the changes of benefits, which are salutary within the MSP, were borne almost entirely by future employees, and we didn't think that was either fair or in any case it was not adequate. We did not get far enough along by imposing the changes so concentrated on employees that are not yet working for the city. It also has a tendency to backload the benefits just because by sort of at risk of being obvious that they don't work here, they have to first work here and then retire before the benefits are generally realized. So the present value of those changes is quite diminished by the passage of time. Third, we thought that the unfunded liability, and we're using a number of $1.7 billion, and that all these numbers are subject to what discount rate used, but $1.5 to $1.7 billion was not sufficiently addressed. This is a large overhang on the city. It must be addressed in an aggressive fashion and in a certain fashion where there is clarity and certainty that that liability will be reduced, and reduced not by hopes of improved market performance, but by a disciplined approach over the long term that will cause that liability to be extinguished. And lastly, which is a derivative of the first three things, that the term of the MSP, which really is the remainder of the term on the 2001 agreement that Mr. Hand referenced, at 17 years, in the context of the solution, it was simply too long. We need to solve this problem, solve it comprehensively, and at that point, a long-term agreement may well be appropriate. But if you don't, the term does matter, and we would need to come back and do more in the future, and therefore we thought the term in the context of the agreement, as it was stated, was too long, is too long. So how do we best solve the problem? We came up with a set of recommendations, only one of which seemed to have drawn any attention in the media, and that's the idea of possibly using debt as a feature of reducing the long-term liability. But let me go through all the recommendations. And the first one, and I would argue the most important one, is we advocate that the city maintain a defined benefit plan for its police and fire servants. That conclusion is not reached lightly. It wasn't reached automatically, and it was only reached after considerable, vigorous debate about other options. And there certainly are other options, and there's a range of them, and you'll hear about them or have heard about them in terms like hybrid plans or cash balance plans or simple 401ks and variations on all those themes. Many members of the Civic Council, many members of our task force strongly support terminating the current defined benefit plan and moving towards something like that, principally for one reason, and that's that it eliminates risk going forward, and risk is a big deal, especially a big deal when you're talking about the size and the length of the agreement that is inherent in a defined benefit plan. But we concluded that the better solution was to maintain the defined benefit plan for several reasons. First, was it met our guiding principle of fairness. Most of us here already have a defined benefit plan. It's called Social Security. It isn't much of a plan, but we have it. But our police and fire workers do not. The city has adopted out many years ago, and they don't have that safety net of a replacement of some part of their income that is guaranteed, and it's difficult to take that away without some form of substitute. Second, there are legal impediments that Mr. Hand referred to terminating a plan like this, and there's financial impediments you have to address on a more accelerated and less favorable basis, funding the unfunded deficit, so that imposes some fiscal stress on the city that would be difficult to meet. Third, and very importantly, we think, the rest of these recommendations will illustrate how, but we think that the defined benefit plan can be changed and moderated in a way that will make it affordable and secure and safe for the city to maintain that. So we thought you could maintain that important benefit and do so in a way that did not pose undue financial risk to the city. And lastly, from this competitive standpoint, we searched, and I will not profess that it was a comprehensive or scientific search, but we looked for other examples of police and fire departments in the country that had done away with defined benefit plans, and there were few. There are a few, but there are very few. And we did not think that eliminating that plan on a go-forward basis would do anything other than make very difficult competitive situation for retaining police and fire workers here in Jacksonville. So those were the reasons that we that we settled upon the recommendation maintaining a defined benefit plan. That recommendation is expressly contingent upon everything else that we recommend. We would not make that recommendation in isolation of remedial changes that would make the plan affordable and of a long-term fix to a very large problem. Next slide covers a bit more some of the more granular recommendations, one of which I already mentioned, and that's to lower the investment return assumptions to no more than 7%. You could make an argument, and the argument was made, that even that is too high. And you can look at that a lot of different ways, and a lot of people much smarter than me, many of whom are on this task force, will have their own opinions about what is a realistic rate of return. Make two observations about that, though. First of all, and I tend to think of it as business with the trader's mentality. If 7% were too conservative, somewhere in the marketplace there would be a counterparty that would take that risk and try to make money on it. I don't know of anybody that will give me a 30-year guarantee at 7%. If it were conservative, somebody would take that bet and make money on my conservatism, but that doesn't exist. So I think that's a practical way of testing whether testing conservatism or optimism about any return. And on that basis, it'd be difficult to say that 7% is too conservative. You could argue that perhaps even 7% is too optimistic. But the history of returns, both for the Police and Fire Pension Fund, the FRS, which, as Mr. Hand indicated, is generally regarded as a well-managed fund, and many others suggest that 7% is a reasonable threshold return. The second point I make is it's not really just a matter of deciding what you think those funds might make. That certainly is important. The more precise question is, what is the city able and willing to guarantee? Because that is effectively what it does. When you make that assumption, if it doesn't happen, you make it up. The city makes it up and increase contributions later. So think about not just what this from a predictive standpoint, but what is a fair guarantee, and there is risk involved in guarantee. Therefore, there should be pricing involved related to that risk. Enough on 7%. A second. Just from a standpoint of plan architecture, we came to a conclusion that we should engineer the retirement costs to about 20% of payroll going forward. There's no precise magic to that number. But there is a lot of research and interpolation around that, and professional judgment by business people. That 20% represents, first of all, a fair and affordable cost going forward. That is normative for many private sector firms, for other cities, and just in your own considerable experience, I think you can see that is sort of relationally correct. It's about the right relationship to that. So we think 20% is a good sort of plan architecture target for the cost of retirement benefits. And the second part of that is we think that 20% ought be equally shared between employer and employee. Gets to a principle of shared sacrifice and to fairness that we thought was important, and we like the symmetry and the logic of everybody being in this pari passu, that we are sharing alike in those costs on a go-forward basis. Third, and this is we suggest lowering the service accrual rate, both for future employees, and it already is being lowered under the MSP, but also for existing employees. That really, though, I want you to think about that a little differently. That isn't an ironclad recommendation, but rather it is a means to an end. It is a way, and one of the few levers you can pull in the cost structure that helps drive that cost down to the 20% benchmark. Lowering the service accrual rate can be done and still be comparative and competitive with other plans, particularly if you compare it to private sector plans, and that may be an invidious comparison, but I think it's a worthwhile one, that moving service accrual rates is a simple and actuarially powerful way to lower long-term costs in a plan. But again, it's only one tool. There could be other ways to achieve the same result. The result being to lower the cost of retirement benefits to approximately 20% of payroll. Fourth, we suggest that the chapter funds, and you've heard about the premium taxes before on that they be earmarked toward this on a permanent basis and applied to the city portion of the contribution. So this 20% 10% city, 10% employees. The chapter funds, which are taxes from employees, there's an argument made that it represents contributions from the members. We think the better argument is that's a taxpayer contribution, just a different form of taxpayer contribution. It ought to be applied to what the city contribution is for its 10%. Lastly, on this slide, we suggest modernizing some of the investment authority within the PFPF to match the well-regarded Florida retirement system, FRS. There are some differences. They're somewhat technical in nature. I won't bore you with them. But on balance, we think the FRS investment authority is an appropriate, modern, good one, and would have some predictive value of raising somewhat the long-term capacity for returns, and do so in a way that is prudent, tested, and balanced from a risk standpoint. Nothing in the FRS guidelines would allow exotic investments or unbalanced portfolios. It's really a well-developed and sophisticated set of guidelines, and one that we commend to your attention. The next recommendation on the next slide is that we recommend considering debt as part of the solution to lower the cost of the unfunded liability and retire it more quickly. Like the first recommendation, we did not come to this easily or without dissent. To be sure, any debt offering, any debt instrument has inherent risk to it. But the way to think about, at least the way that we think about this, is the debt's already been incurred. The city owes $1.7 billion to the police and fire fund, and the form of that debt is really much more what's in question than the existence of that debt. So this isn't adding debt, rather it's refinancing debt. Refinancing is not without risk either, so I don't mean to imply that makes the decision less fraught with risk or less difficult, but it's a more accurate characterization than thinking about what the city's going on adding new debt. It's not. It's replacing debt it already has. And so the question becomes, can you do that on sufficiently favorable terms that you think that there is a good bet, a good risk to take at lowering the cost? We think, in all likelihood, the answer to that question is yet. The debt that the city already has is $1.7 billion of unfunded liability. By virtue of plan design, grows at about 7%. So it's expensive debt right now. We think, but do not know, that debt could be refinanced probably in the 4.5%. Remember, these would be taxable bonds because it's not a tax-exempt purpose. So it's a higher rate of interest. For purposes of modeling the impact, we have assumed a debt offering of $1 billion. And I also say that now, not knowing the debt capacity of the city, that needs to be tested and what covenants it has and things like that. But for modeling purposes and to illustrate the point, we assumed $1 billion of debt at 4.5% interest amortized over 22 years. No magic in those terms. It's simply modeling assumptions that were made. Doing that would lower, we think, the total unfunded liability, the total obligation, by about $173 million, and I'll get to that a bit more. So the benefits are appreciable. The risks are to be minded and considered, but we believe there is enough that the current environment is one in which that should be thoughtfully explored. Again, no magic to the amount of debt. You could make that anywhere from 0 to $1.7 billion and test it, and the cost benefits, slide accordingly, assuming that the underlying assumptions prove to be accurate. But effectively, you're betting that that over the long term, the fund can produce 7% on assets, and that you can debt finance part of that cheaper, and also assuming that interest rates are either stable or rising. If they were going to plummet to 2%, it wouldn't be a very good idea to borrow money today at 4%, which I guess is obvious. The next slide tries to illustrate in just a different graphical representation, kind of what the situation we have is and what happens with some of these recommendations. What this graph tries to show is where the money comes from to pay for the obligations, assuming that all of the mayor's MSB recommendation made, all of which, by the way, we support. What the city did was all good, and every bit of that ought to be preserved, plus the recommendations that we've recommended here, but not the debt, is what this slide tries to show. And what that shows is that the contributions for the city, just staying with the city part right now, go from about $127 million in 2014. They rise to a high of $242 million in 2034. So it starts off as more expensive in the first couple of years than the MSP, less expensive in the out years. I believe the MSP's peak contribution, I'm doing this from memory now, is $330 million in 2034, 2035. This is $242 million, so appreciably less. And so you can see the benefits of that, and then it drops off. The next slide is just another way of comparing different proposals in different circumstances. That top line, I'm colorblind, so I think it's red, but I'll stand corrected, shows is the status quo before the MSP, before anything. If we don't do anything, and that has the line that starts high, goes higher, peaking at $411 million, and that's the problem that we're all trying to solve. The yellow line represents the slope under the immediate sum proposal, and you can see quite a bit less money, particularly in the out years, and this sort of illustrates sort of the present value issue or the backloaded benefits. But in the out years, there are significant benefits. The peak contribution from the city rises at $330 million. It starts at $102 million, largely through application of some non-recurring assumptions in the first 2 years. The third line, and I don't know the color, I'm going to say green, is the Civic Council recommendations, except for the $1 billion of debt refinancing, and you can see the same numbers there, peaking at $242 million. And the last line recommends, reflects all of the changes, including $1 billion of debt under the assumptions I previously outlined. The next slide just shows the slope and trajectory of the unfunded liability. Obviously, the interposition of reducing that liability by $1 billion of debt lowers it quickly, does so at a predictable and static cost, and retires the debt somewhat more readily. The next slide is also in a graphic representation, shows what happens if you take all of the Civic Council recommendations, everything in the MSP, and the $1 billion of debt under the assumptions that I previously outlined. And what happens there is the initial contributions sitting are a little higher, $131 million in 2014, rising to $182 million in 2033, and then dropping off thereafter. So there's a significant benefit to the debt if you accept the assumptions that we've made. The next slide is it tries to show the savings in a waterfall chart, and we look at this slightly differently. We take all of the predicted contributions to 2043, reduce that to a present value, and that gets to $2.4 billion, the large bar on the left. Using that same discount methodology, the benefits in the MSP, which are significant, have a present value of about $363 million. So it takes a big lick out of the problem. We add to that $52 million of costs on a present value basis, additive, not a reduction, and that reflects changing the discount rate down to 7%, which increases the cost to the city as a result. The $271 million in the next little bar is the present value of all the Civic Council recommendations except for debt, and the 175 is the further savings achieved via the debt offering based on our modeling assumptions, and that gets it down to $1.67 billion. And that is just, I guess that is a way of just kind of sort of summarizing where the buckets of money are. All those things can change. They're reflective of the modeling that we did. And by the way, we were supported in the modeling through Jarman and Associates, the actuary that the Police and Fire Pension Fund used. So that plus internal resources provided by Civic Council members is the basis. I will not tell you that all these have been tested with actual certainty. We didn't have the time to do that, but they are dimensionally correct. I will assert that much for you. But they do need to be tested. They need to be further analyzed with the full actuarial support. And I'm quite pleased that you have voted to retain the Pew Foundation, provide that much needed technical resource to further test these and any other ideas that come before you. The next slide illustrates I'll call it the shared sacrifice, the shared costs, and what's on the left is how the costs for current and past services are shared among the parties. You can see the city has the largest share of that at 78%. Another piece is paid for by the so-called chapter funds, and then employee contributions that come off the paycheck currently. The pie chart on the left shows what happens in the future, and you can see it gets to this roughly 50-50 sharing with the employees paying 48% of the cost. That doesn't mean it doubled or tripled. It just means that the costs have been lowered and then reallocated slightly. The city's contribution directly is 32%. The chapter funds add the other 20% to that. So this roughly gets to that 50-50 model. And again, you can pull these levers differently. You can change some of the mix. And I encourage you to stay focused on this idea of establishing what is an affordable benchmark. We came at 20%. Maybe you say 18, maybe you say 25%, but there needs to be some sense of what can we afford as a city to pay for retirement and pay for it for the long term. Our answer is 20%. Debate it, beat it up, change it, but I think that it's an important question to ask and answer. So the summary of what we recommend is this. We taken all the recommendations together, the Civic Council, and what had been achieved through the immediate sale proposal, $750 million. That's about double what the MSP had on its own terms. The annual city contributions peak at $182 million in 2033, starting at $131. Expensive spending, but in the context of the city budget, particularly if the millage rate increase ultimately is approved, we think is affordable. And I say that watching the finance chair the corner of my eye, so he may or may not have a different view of that, but at least it's dimensionally in something you can get your arms around, unlike $400 million or even $300 million in the out years. But $180 million over the next 20 years feels like something we can probably find a path toward funding. The unfunded liability changes a lot. The proportional share of future costs is balanced, and balanced, we think, in a way that is favorable, and importantly, reduce the pension costs to about 20% of payroll on a go-forward basis. So that's what we think, and a bit of an illustration why we think. In addition to this little slide deck, you should have a copy of the letter, which is a bit more detailed in some of these recommendations. It is addressed as before to Mayor Brown, Council President Gulliford, and importantly to Chairman Shai, indicating in a tangible way our interest in working with you as a friend, as a partner. We will continue to be engaged and interested. The Civic Council's encouragement to me as the chair is one of urgency, and to make sure we stay focused on this asset. It does not get easier. It is not like fine wine. It doesn't get better with age. And I am pleased to observe how hard you are working. 2 meetings this week already, and encourage that same dedication. Your city will be forever enriched by your efforts. Thank you, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Steve. Questions? Hey, Ted.
Hey, and Mr. Chairman, I apologize for being late. I had something that went late, and I'm very dedicated to the committee, and I please don't show my tardiness as any disrespect.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Grateful that you are. Questions? Sure.
So it's paid back over 22 years, this billion, and I get the math, so we earn more than we owe on it. How concerned are you all if there's a 36-month dip, a 2008 collapse that we've just been through? How does that figure into the thinking?
Well, that is you put your finger, Ms. Miguel, on a primary issue with defined benefit plans, is they are inherently long-term. They get scary sometimes over short-term. If there is a dip in that and say that the assets earn 0 or lose 10%, that unfunded liability will go up and go up a lot on that in the short term. The actuaries can explain this much more competently than I can, but as they calculate the city contributions, there is a smoothing process, so it's not quite as volatile as those kind of returns would apply. But to be sure, the liability would go up. So the question is, do you put $1 billion of assets into the hands of of the pension fund to invest and try to earn money. And the pessimists say, well, what if they lose money? Then we're worse off, and they would be right about that. But the record suggests, and the facts suggest, that a competently managed pension fund, and the results of the PFBF would accord with this, they will earn money. They'll earn it at predictable rates over a long enough term. It smooths out short-term market cycles. And we think a 7% is a not unreasonable benchmark to use on that. It could do worse. It hasn't done worse. It's done better than that over a 30-year period. If you look at a 10-year period, it hasn't done as well, but over enough time, we think these are fair assumptions to make. I will not say it's risk-free. Some people call it risk or interest rate arbitrage. I don't use that term. That suggests you got a fix on both of them. You don't on this. It's a bet, and it's a bet that the long-term returns will exceed the cost of debt. And if it does, there's a capital efficiency in using fixed rate debt to retire this obligation. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but.
Yeah, I didn't ask it very well. I get the long term. My question really is to what happens to the city budget, and do we need to worry about it if we have a short term
I'm sorry.
correction?
You do need to worry about it to a degree. Well, you don't have to, if there is a short term, bad market cycle, and the fund loses 10% or 20% or whatever the results are, but they're below the 7% return. You don't have to make it up all at once. The actuarial, and there's math and regulation, but they will calculate what you have to do. The likelihood is your obligation will go up. The city's obligation will go up a bit on that, but it'll be smoothed out over a longer term. So to get a more competent answer, you really need to have the actuaries do some modeling, and they can demonstrate that to you.
Others? I had a question similar to that. So it's hard to understand if you give the pension board $1 billion. I mean, you're satisfying liability, but you still really have the liability because of the risk of investment. So as Sherry says, 3 years down the road, the market drops. The contribution from the city still has got to go back up over that short term because of the actuarial assumptions related to the total pension contribution that the city would have to make.
Yes, the city always has a liability, and it never goes away because you're guaranteeing replacement income based on certain assumptions. So it's not an extinguishment of liability, but rather it's applying assets that the predictive notion is that those assets will begin to earn money and earn money more than the debt service. That if they don't, it will have been a bad bet. If they earn more, it will be a good bet on it. But the liability, it's not like paying off your home mortgage and the debt's gone. The city has an ongoing permanent obligation, and it does today. The point I'd make is that debt is going up anyway. It's going up at 7% a year, so if you don't do anything, that $1.7 billion will be higher next year. And it's going to be higher at a rate of 7%. So the real analytical question is, can we do better?
So from the perspective of the city council, would it be better to maintain leverage over the investment policies to commit to, say, $2 million a year to go to the unfunded liability, which is $90 million a year, rather than borrow money and put it all out there?
If that would be a good move if you think 7% is a good rate to pay, because that's what you're paying on that debt. The debt exists, and it's growing at 7%. The only question is, can you replace that with and believe that those funds would earn more than 4.5%, and it's or more than 7%, and it's risky. It's not free from doubt.
Related to that, I'm looking at the chart with the red, yellow, light green, and dark green.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Civic Council in 2036, y'all show $182 million payment. That's the payment from the city, contribution from the city.
Yes.
Right. So does that 182 also include the debt payment on
It
the
does.
pension bond? So that's an aggregate.
Yes, and I should have. Thank you for catching it. It includes both the contribution and debt service based on the assumptions that I gave you.
That makes a difference, right?
Yes.
Okay. Steve, I'd like to, if we're having a very transparent process, and I think the paper has really been, and all the press have been appreciative of that. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of the Civic Council and how y'all got to where this was. And by that I mean, what committee, who were they? How many
Sure,
people?
I can tell you some of that, not all that, because we're not as transparent as you are. The way the Civic Council is 59 members, it's soon to be growing to about 64 members within the next couple weeks, and they're principally CEOs of businesses or leaders of other enterprises. Many of this task force are members on it. We are explicitly private, so we try to observe the sensibilities that go with that. The task force structure is we ask members, or they volunteer to serve on task forces based on their interests. We've had a task force on downtown redevelopment. We've had one on race relations. We have one on pension reform. And so we had people that volunteered to be part of that, or were asked to be part of that. Going back to 2010, it was chaired by Walt Basels on that. Since that time, he became a trustee of the Police and Fire Pension Fund. So, needless to say, he excused himself, and we excused him for the use. He's completely exempted from that. The remaining task force, chaired by Peter Rummel. There are a number of members of the Civic Council on it, but we also have members on it that are not Civic Council members, just because we didn't have enough subject matter expertise. I mentioned David Ward because he said we could. David is not a Civic Council member. His boss, Michael Ward, is. So he was generously donated by CSX and has been a superb addition. We had lawyers that were not members of the council but brought competency and knowledge, and others that just brought their expertise. Not all of them wanted to have their names disclosed, so I said that I wouldn't without permission. Only you get a lot of attention, and you make new friends, as all of you have when you get involved in these things. And not everybody wanted to contribute, but they didn't necessarily want to be public about it. So unless people say that they don't mind having the names disclosed, I just don't. But I've given you some of the key people.
Be helpful. Some of them, I know who some of them are, and they're very capable, and I think the community might get some confidence.
Yeah, what I will do, and our executive director Susie Wiles is behind me. I'll just ask her to ask them, and we'll certainly disclose anybody's name that doesn't mind.
She's glaring at me right now.
She's glaring. She's probably glaring at me. I just can't see her. But
how many people? And I know it fluctuated, but how many of the 59 people? How many were they, generally speaking?
It was out of the 59 members, about 4 or 5 that were engaged in this, and I exclude Walt Basels, who was engaged earlier on, but not in the current work in the last several months. And
so that group of 4 plus the
plus the non-Civic Council member committee members, fewer than a dozen, 8 or 9, I think.
So when they presented their proposal to you, presumably, you took it to your board.
Well, they didn't present a proposal to me. I participate in these things because of my interest in it, and so it was really working sessions, and we beat up these ideas, and we include other people that we invited John Kane to the meeting, not to imply any endorsement, and I want to be explicit about that. John participated in all of our meetings, was very effective in doing so. I promised him I would never say he endorses anything in it. He'll tell you what he endorses and doesn't endorse, but we thought it was helpful to engage his perspective as a subject matter expert, and that proved to be actually quite helpful on it. So it was a set of recommendations that got produced into the letter that you saw that I principally authored, but with a lot of help from the committee members. We then took it to our board.
And the board is how many people?
The board is, Susan, correct me, I think we have 11 board members. Because of the importance of the issue, I invited any Civic Council member to participate in that board meeting. Technically, the board approved it and had that responsibility and vote on it, but I invited any Civic Council member to attend that chose to, and many did on that telephonically. So the board of roughly 11 voted. They voted unanimously to support this set of recommendations, and authorized me to transmit the letter to you and the mayor and President Gulliford.
And they had presumably time to reflect upon the proposal.
They had it in advance, and days in advance. I don't remember precisely how much time they had, but they had, and it was an iterative process of communication. So they had been informed, informally about the direction we were taking.
Okay, and they then were authorized on behalf of the Civic Council to direct you to deliver the letter.
Yes.
Okay, right. I really think that helps the community understand your process, and it certainly helps us understand too. So, other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Charlie.
Thank you, Steve, for your presentation. Obviously, very, very good product here. I think the question that was asked earlier is the question everybody has in terms of the $1 billion. Has anybody, if it was handed out earlier when Chris Hand discussed, and on his page 4 of his presentation, the one that always gets people's attention is how the unfunded liability has increased from approximately $400 million from 2003 to 1.7 or 1.8 billion dollars today. Has anybody determined what that unfunded liability would have been over that time period if the plan had been, I'll say, fully funded or maybe 80% funded? Unquestionably, from 2003 to 2012, we experienced an extraordinary downturn for anybody making investments over the time period. I think something tells me that a significant portion of the unfunded liability exists today because the funds were not there to invest.
We did not. It's an outstanding question. We tried hard and perhaps too hard not to look backward a lot and do a lot of reflection because we didn't want it to turn into sort of a blame game about who did what. We didn't think that was productive. Clearly, though, you are right that not having adequate funds to invest hurt the fund performance, short term and long term. Clearly, the adverse market conditions had a big impact on the unfunded liability, as it did in everybody's personal investments. Also, clearly, some of the there was, I would say, a lack of full appreciation for what small changes in compensation structure do to long-term pension obligations. I was struck, frankly, about how sensitive these liabilities are to relatively small changes in the assumptions about payroll growth. If you assume even a 1% difference from what you assume and it's higher, that can have maybe a 30% impact on over time on the total pension obligation. So it requires, as do any defined benefit plan, great discipline around making sure that the compensation adjustments that you make over time are consistent with your funding of the plan and your assumptions about it, because they will drive the cost very, very quickly. We did not go and break down all the component parts in it, but your beginning assertion is certainly correct.
I think that'd be helpful, and I agree with not going back and try to point fingers as to perhaps what caused the problem, but to answer the question is, okay, what if we did borrow $1 billion and contribute to the plan, and, oh, by the way, we know for a fact that over the long term there will be a downturn in the stock market. We know that will occur. We just don't know when it will occur. But if you were to back test this, knowing how horrible that was, if you still saw a significant enough increase to overcome the cost of the city of a 4.5%, I think that would give a lot of, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but
I don't either. I think it's a great question, a great idea, and a great analytic is go back over time and assume that you stayed fully funded, or say 95%, but some number through those market cycles, and see where you were. And but I'd be willing to bet you'd be better off than where you are right now.
And I see the few people taking notes, so that's something that they.
That's a very good idea.
That's great. Super. Tad?
Yeah, well, one comment I'd have, and I think that's an excellent question, but one comment I'd have is, if you compare it to the state fund, which has been fully funded or basically fully funded all along, it's in a very good financial position despite the market downturn, the same thing, and that probably will suggest that if there was greater funding, I think the JCCI studies supported that. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, your plan here assumes a 20% total cost of pension, of payroll.
Yes.
How do you get to, I mean, first of all, what is the total cost now that you calculate of payroll as
It's a good question, and one I should have addressed during the course of my comments. And the precise answer gets complicated, so I'll try to simplify it and hopefully not lose much accuracy in it. But if you look at the status quo of what things are, which is really past service current employees, pension obligations are roughly 40% of payroll. If you look at what is achieved through the immediate settlement proposal for future employees, that is dropped all the way down to, I think, approximately 22%. So in my comments, in other words, I said I thought the administration did a very good job as a future employees, and you can see that we're recommending getting 20%. They're already at 22% round numbers. So, a little bit of further work is all that we would recommend. The existing employee cost as a proportion of pay is really quite high, and it's quite high for a lot of different reasons on it.
Does that take into account the cost of the unfunded liabilities?
Yes, it does.
So
It does.
We're talking about the higher current cost. That's because of the unfunded liabilities.
Precisely, and that was my next point. Do not interpret that comment as saying they all got really fat plans, because that's not accurate. What they have is a plan that is generous, and it costs approximately $50 million a year to maintain those current services, and all the rest is paying bills we haven't been paying over the past several years. That's the accumulated cost in your credit card.
Well, a follow-up to that. I understand that you are advocating it as the latest, the negotiated plan, a reduction in the benefits, a fairly modest reduction, but it's still
Yes.
a reduction in increased contribution by the employees. Both of those things, I know we're talking about pensions and we're separating that from compensation, but in truth, where I come from is, as a labor and employment attorney, compensation means all your benefits. So,
Precisely.
Really what you're talking, and what I'm questioning, because your other comment was, you've got to be we have a very distinct relationship between the compensation paid to the employee and the cost of the pension, how much it goes up based on small changes. If we're talking about, meaning the base compensation, if we're talking about altering the total compensation package of the employees by requiring them to pay more to get less at the end, we are necessarily creating a situation where, in order to remain competitive for those positions, salaries are going to go up, and they're going to go up more than under the current system. We have market forces. We have to attract and maintain people. We have to pay people more if we're not going to give them better, as great a pension. Did y'all factor in those greater, baseline costs when you're talking about these future costs for the pension system?
We stayed with. It's a good question. And your underlying predicate is exactly right. It's very sensitive, and I'm in business. Compensation goes in different buckets, but it all adds up. We stayed with the same assumptions about wage growth that was contained in the MSP, and it was based upon the actuarial work that was done. We had no reason to quarrel with that. We didn't change it, so we didn't say, no, the city's all wrong, they're going to end up paying a lot more. They might. And if they do, those costs go up, and they go up appreciably. Getting the pension benefit to an appropriate proportion of pay mitigates that to a degree. If it's only 20% as opposed to 40%, you're more better on that. But you're precisely right that if there's pressure that is above the embedded, I think it's 3.5% growth over time, but if it's actually higher than that, the costs of all this go up, and they go up rather quickly on that, which means the city contribution would need to go up. It's why we stayed so focused on on proportionality, and that's to keep the pension costs in a relative proportion that we thought was balanced to pay. I would disagree if you're suggesting that is below market and therefore drives artificially higher salary costs. We don't believe that to be true. I think the 20% is a good benchmark. And remember, we are not changing any benefits for the city at all. And Mr. Hand indicated they cannot be changed if they're vested benefits. Under Florida law, they can't be changed, and we don't change a dime of its existing benefits. We do suggest slowing out service accrual rate going forward. So if I'm a city employee and I've accrued and I've been working for 10 years, I have whatever I have. My next year working, I'll accrue a little bit less of future service credit next year and every year thereafter. We also recommended freezing the COLA adjustments on that, another big actuarial driver on that. The MSP proposed lowering it. We say get rid of it until the plan reaches 80% funding on that, because it's such a big driver, and giving raises on money you don't have, we don't think is an affordable prospect. All of those things work together with the idea of lowering the costs. And clearly they have to be negotiated and batted about, and we don't rest on any one of those, but rather than the collection of things that can be done to lower the cost to this 20% of payroll benchmark that we've established.
Yeah, the one thing that I would sort of add as an observation, I think it's something that, and all this stuff is very complex. It's a lot of moving parts to this, but I understand that current employees are vested in that type of thing, but in terms of reducing the rate of accrual in the future for vested employees, did you consider whether that would encourage those vested employees to leave the plan sooner, and therefore, and what the cost would be of doing that in terms of
We did not make any changes, only because we had no basis for doing that. It was speculative. So we stayed with that, and we did not assume there'd be either adverse or positive benefits to that. We did take out, if you recall, there was in the first letter that I sent, we'd recommended getting rid of the drop and the backdrop programs. On further assessment, as we looked at it, particularly the backdrop program, which is what the administration's made some proposed, we thought the cost benefits of getting rid of it were far greater than the headache caused, because we were persuaded by the police unions that is a valuable management tool. It doesn't cost that much, so we left that recommendation out. Mr. Akins?
Does your trajectories include the debt service on the $1 billion bond issuance? The unfunded liability that remains, which is the $0.7 billion, plus the annual contribution. Is that the total cost to the city, those three items?
Yes. Everything we represent as total city costs includes all of the actually predicted required contribution to ACA, as well as the debt service on that. So yeah, it's all included.
I didn't what you said.
Just a comment, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just for the police and fire pension fund alone. So the comment is $148 million this year. That's for the police and fire pension fund. That's not including the general employees. If you add those two together, it's $181 million. So the $1.7 billion is the unfunded liability for the police and fire pension fund. It does not include the general employees.
That's exactly right, and that's a very important point. All of this report and all of our recommendations relate solely to the police and fire pension fund, not because we're not trying to say that just was the context of the immediate sale proposal, so that's the analytics, but the same issues apply to the general employee pension plan on that, which is approximately $1 billion underfunded. So council member is exactly correct in his assessment. Everything you read here, we got another $1 billion approximately to solve, but we stayed with the police and fire.
That was smart. And within the context of the legal constraints, you have the 30-year agreement, so you really have to negotiate within that for the police and fire. But for the general employees, you have 3-year rolling collective bargaining, which the city council is the ultimate determiner of that if there's an impasse. So there's a real difference in negotiating.
There is, and that's why it just got too complex to do it. So we stayed with the issue at hand, which was and it was before the city council, which was what to do about the police and fire pension fund and the settlement proposal that came before city council. But yeah, there are differences. The underlying sort of financial architecture is much the same, and Councilmember Anderson's exactly right. We have to solve that problem too, but little steps for small feet.
But I've already talked with the Pew folks, knowing how pleased they will be with us and how pleased we will be with them, that they might want to help us with the next one along the way. But they haven't promised to do that.
God bless you both. That's a worthwhile task.
So, any other questions? Gwen? Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit more about contribution of real estate?
Yes.
How that would work, and if it would be immediately sold so that the assets would be a part of the funding, or if it's just a part of the portfolio?
Certainly. It's an important question, and I've not had the chance to study Councilmember Schellenberg's bill yet, so it's just been described to me, so if I mischaracterize it, I do so unintentionally. But the idea of taking certain, sometimes called lazy assets, just say assets the city has, and contributing them to is a valid concept. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you look at my letter, we don't say take on $1 billion of debt, we say add $1 billion of assets. For modeling purposes, we assumed that would all be debt. We didn't get into the real estate. But there is nothing wrong with contributing real estate or any other assets. 2 points to raise. Mr. Hand indicated there needs to be some fair value, or there ought to be some fair valuation, or people lose faith and confidence in the validity of that transaction. And real estate isn't susceptible of highly precise. It's not like stocks. You can go read the Wall Street Journal and find out what it's worth today. Real estate is an argument about what it's worth. So we would commend that as an idea. We would commend it in the context of a prudent investment portfolio. So that has to be, you don't want to have it a 50% in real estate. Real estate goes up, it goes down. But it has a part in an investment portfolio, and if it's within the investment guidelines and the investment manager's advice, we would have no opposition to that. The other comment to make, though, about the valuation is, while it is important to get that fair and right on one level, on another level, it is a little less important. If you donate the city donates real estate that is arguably somewhat undervalued, it's a benefit to the pension fund, it's a detriment to the city's balance sheet, but as Chairman Shai points out, the city has both sides of that bet anyway. So if that real estate asset outperforms because the basis cost was lower, that accrues to the benefit of the pension fund and whatever its aggregate returns are for it. So this gets awfully esoteric, but in a way it is return indifferent if you don't have it properly valued. I just wouldn't want to explain that to the public.
John?
Charlton, you said that these pieces hang together. And I guess I'd be a little, I don't want to push you to a place you don't want to go, but in terms of modernizing the investment authority to match the Florida retirement system, what exactly does that mean?
I don't have I don't have the precise guidance, but we went through that and noted differences, and our view was that the investment authority for FRS is more current, it's more modern, it anticipates some classes of assets that either weren't popular or weren't used, and that I don't mean derivatives and exotic things like that, but just more sophisticated financial instruments. It has a similar structure in terms of asset diversification and other things on it. It's just a somewhat more modernized version. It doesn't. You would look in vain to see some big philosophical difference, like it thinks more highly of real estate or things like that. It's really tweaks around the edges and a bit more comprehensive description of assets and asset classes. We just think it's an improved version of what the PFPF operates under right now. It's not the biggest recommendation, but it was important enough that we thought it merited inclusion in our letter.
Well, you've acknowledged the risk of the borrowing and what that might be in the short term. And I guess the idea of giving $1 billion to what appears to be kind of an underperforming situation, I'm not trying to sound harsh, but seems like an interesting, given that risk, interesting thing to do. So.
Well, I wouldn't. I personally wouldn't use words like underperforming or overperforming, but rather refer to it objectively.
Right.
Over time, it's earned more than 7%, less than 8%, depending on the time period you have. Short term, it's underperformed. Relative to FRS, it is underperformed by about, if I'm just from memory, I think by about 40 basis points. Not insignificant by any means on that, but they haven't. They haven't been derelict or outside of a normal distribution or within a standard deviation of normal returns for other investment advisors. So I hesitate to say that that's the problem, that all you have to do is have a better performing fund. I don't think that's the case. I think it's been generally managed within norms for funds like that. Perhaps not at the very highest level, not maybe even right exactly what you like to get, but close enough that I think it's a distraction to look at that as a problem, and that's why this recommendation is somewhat subordinated to some of the larger ones. I think it could do better. I think it would do better if it had a more modern set of investment guidelines and investment authority around it. But that isn't the big problem in our judgment.
Let me just point out, then Carl, just a second. Mr. Keene has said before that they had tried to get their investment authority broadened. And so y'all would have the background item, document 8 under subsection A of your booklet is a report from the investment manager of the Summit Strategies of the Police and Fire Pension Fund, dated December 20th of 2012, and they deal with investment return, investment diversification, so that would be helpful to you. That's not the FRS proposal, but that'd be useful to know, and I'm sure Pew is going to get that. But that gives you an idea. They've been trying to broaden it. They asked the city council to do it when Greg, a year or two ago, and that was disapproved. And I don't know the reasons for that, but that is certainly something that's on our plate.
We did announce that we came to benchmark against the FRS. We thought it was a competently run plan that had good guidelines. The Pew resources you now have, I'm sure, will give you other deeper analytics that it's not binary. It's not this or that. There's a whole range of things, and there's betas of risk involved and things like that. But they'll give you some good a good spectrum of information.
Probably delegated to the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund Investment Committee, and they do a great job. John?
Well, I don't propose to be an expert here, but I don't see how we can not say it's underperforming. We are, I mean, in the material we've been given, this is an F-rated plan, 40% funded. Okay. In terms of where we stand relative to others who've gone through, as Mr. Appleby said, the same stock market travails as everybody else, we find ourselves in a very different spot than many of the counties in our state and the country. And we also find ourselves in the same boat as many others. But I guess the question is really around, if we're going to, if we propose $1 billion going somewhere, what's our best odds of that truly translating to a difference between what the borrowing costs and what the earnings are?
And that's one reason it's just questionable to me whether it'd be better from the city council's perspective to make a commitment to fund a dedicated portion of the millage to the unfunded liability rather than to get. And I know that affects it overall, but whether that wouldn't be a better strategy than just.
Well, but
put that in. Right.
Well, and to that end, has the Civic Council analyzed if you're going to take out $1 billion loan, where we could best invest that as a community to get a better economic return than 7%? And where would other opportunities be to invest that kind of borrowing?
That's a good idea.
One of the big issues is when you borrow this amount of money and put it in the hands of the Police and Fire Pension Fund, is if it doesn't work, it comes right back to the city and the taxpayer. And so none of the proposals we've seen balance that risk. And has the Civic Council analyzed how we can better balance risk while we're trying to balance costs today?
You are right to put your finger on risk, because I think that's one of the critical questions the city has faced. But I keep saying, the city has the risk right now. It has borrowed the money, and it's paying interest on that money. It's paying at 7%. That's the way the plan design is. So that it's not static. It doesn't just sit there waiting patiently for us to address. It's growing, and it's growing at a fast rate. So the idea of, and we're proposing debt and giving it to the Police and Fire Pension Fund, you would do that to the point that was earlier raised if you believed in that you had proper investment guidelines that would allow that return assumption to be realistically achieved, and you believed in the governance and management of the pension fund, the people in whom you are entrusting that $1 billion. My only point is you've already made that decision. They're doing that already on that, and the city's debt is growing, at a high rate. So it's not like nothing's happening. It's happening right now, but it is perfectly appropriate to look at the structure of that authority from a governance standpoint, from an investment authority standpoint, so that you or the city has confidence that whatever funds it's managing, it can predictably manage them over the long term to appropriate levels of return that meet or exceed thresholds.
I'm just suggesting that history doesn't suggest that would be the
The recent history, you could make a good point. History's, you got to, I guess, define your time. I was thinking of that more of a 20 or 30 year time, and not trying. I don't want to be judged over the last 10 years very much either. But your point's well taken.
I just want to point out, and then Sherry, then Carl. Carl. Item 9 under paragraph A is a memo from Joey Grieve, who's the treasurer, that gives you the rates of return for the police and fire pension fund rates over the last 10 years. Now, these columns are a little confusing to me, and I've asked the chief financial officer to help me understand them, but the actual rate of return, that the actuarial rate, that takes into account ins and outs from the fund. The market value return, as I understand it, which is the last column, is the 1 year rate of return on the investments themselves. I may be misstating that, but Ronnie's going to clear that up for us. But that at least is a sheet that gives you some idea of investment performance. Carl? Yep.
I think when we speak to being 38% funded or 40% funded, you have two culprits, potential culprits. You have the investment return shortage against gold, which apparently we have had.
Yes.
Which I think we need to look not at the last 10 years, but we need to look back 20 or 25 years and 20 or 25 years forward, because to your point, it's long term. Even if we borrowed the money of the $1 billion, it would have to be long. The second part of it, though, is what has been referred to as the unfunded part that was not, on an annual basis, was not forthcoming from the city, which we discussed a couple of meetings ago as to why the actuary would put forth a number, I presume, every year. And they would say, this is the number that is needed to fund it. I'm assuming that the Florida retirement system probably funds what the actuary says is required. Otherwise, they wouldn't be at 70% funded.
You're right on all count. If I interrupt you, go ahead.
The big question becomes, does the city council and in the mayor's administration, going way back, do they fund what the actuaries say is needed? And if they don't, why not? And going forward, if they continue to do that, it doesn't matter what we do here. If they don't fund each year what is required, and I guess it becomes political, so someone needs to address that, but if they don't fund it each year, it won't make any difference. You can make your number with your investments, but it has to be funded.
Yeah. I'll take the last part first, and I'll stand corrected because I'm doing this from memory. I believe that the city has always funded what the actuary said it had to fund, because they have to by law. Devil's the details. And when they say they funded it, there's different sources of that funding. There was the way the accounts were set up, there were sort of surplus funds, and these premium tax, the so-called chapter funds, can figure into this conversation. And at risk of oversimplification, when the city met its legally required contribution, it did so partly by just writing a check, and partly by allocating funds from reserves. And just as with anybody, if you take the reserves out of the good years, when the lean years come, your reserves are depleted, and that contributes to the fund. So I don't believe they ever violated the law and didn't contribute, but the precise way they contributed was not adequate. Further, the investment return assumptions going back were much higher. Mr. Hans correctly point out that it's at 7.75%. It was not always us. It was before 8.4, 8.5%, and which was a much, much higher threshold to meet and missed much more frequently, and that likewise contributed to the liability.
So you believe that if we establish 7% as the industrial return, and if we hit that number, that the council and administrations are doing the proper thing currently, so that we would be balanced?
In addition to the other recommendations, we're taking the chapter funds and not putting them aside that can be used differentially. They're always in. They're always in 100%. They're always in for a stated purpose as part of that city's contribution. So we think you need to tighten up all that so there is much more discipline around that funding, and you pay in real money, not in reallocation from different accounts and reserves and things. In real money, make that contribution each and every year. Some years, in good times, you might even be overfunded. Not such a bad thing on that. Stay overfunded, because eventually those worms always tend to turn, and Mr. Appley is correct. We know there'll be another market downturn. We just don't know when.
But that's the overall, with the good and the bad, that's what the
Precisely.
horizon. And Carl, what happened, as I understand it, Mr. Keene spoke to this, I believe, that you had they didn't take it out of city reserves. They took it out of the the excess funds that was the surplus investment. So
That's right.
that reduced the year-to-year contribution. So that meant, as Steve has said, you didn't get the benefit of those overages going forward. You used those to fund it. So that reduced the general fund contribution, but it had a dramatic effect in that the funds didn't get the benefit
That's
over the long haul.
That's exactly right.
I'm afraid if we don't make a recommendation for change in that regard,
Yep.
that it needs to change.
The discipline of the city council.
And,
Yep.
and we might change it, and then we're 4 administrations down the road,
Right.
and they get lazy and they go right back
Right.
to it. It has to be in the law
Right.
somehow, just like the city budget by law has to be balanced every year. Seems like the pension fund should be balanced.
That is an argument, I would think, just thinking legally, for having the bonds, because then you've got a third-party covenant, and at least the city council has got to honor that contract, as opposed to the obligation to.
You're right. One of the reasons, and I didn't want to highlight this precisely, but one of the advantages in our judgment about debt is its certainty. The interest payment comes due, and you pay it every quarter, and you don't decide whether you're going to pay it or change it, and so we think that helps impose a discipline. To Mr. Cannon's point, the Civic Council is 100% in agreement to establish that discipline. Do so in a structural way so it cannot be changed. And so if there's years where there's a surplus returns, great. Leave them in as surplus returns, because someday there won't be surplus returns. There'll be deficits and it'll balance out. I think if I remember right, the current year performance, and I'm not sure what the time period is for that, is quite positive, maybe 14%. Wonderful. Don't take a nickel out. Leave it all in, because someday it's not going to be that.
That's exactly right. Other questions? Charlie?
I think the complication, Carl, to your question, and I think I'm correct when I say this, in terms of the unfunded status, the easiest way to see how we can become, let's say we're 100% funded and we have underperformance on the investments. And let's say that produces X amount of underfunded liability. I believe under Florida law, and if I say this incorrectly, somebody correct me, what you have to do is, whatever that number is, in order not to put too much of a financial obligation on the municipality, that's then assumed to be funded over 30 years.
Right.
So you put in that underfunded this year, you have 30 years to make that up. So next year you have another underperformance. And oh, by the way, you've got another 30 years to put that in. And next year you have another underperformance, and you have another 30 years. So what they're doing is they're meeting their obligation each year to fund the obligation, but it's being pushed off into the future, which is why you see this huge contributions going from where we are and accelerating up, because it's all those prior years of the 30-year amortization of the unfunded liabilities what's pushing us up so high. So they meet their legal requirements, but it produces, it's the epitome of kicking the can down the road.
That's exactly right, and that's the smoothing talking. The city, I think, would assert correctly that it met its legal obligations each and every year. Our sense is that is legally adequate, but it's insufficient. You have to do better than that. or we won't get out of this problem and we risk getting back into it or deepening an already too deep hole.
Sure.
Steve, just to go back to the investment strategy, policies, and the governance structure, are you trying to tell us borrowing the $1 billion, if the city goes that route, is contingent upon these changes, that structure has to change? And how frequently are the strategies and the policies reviewed?
In terms of if the question is about the governance structure, we did not, we talked a lot about it, but ultimately didn't come down with a precise recommendation on governance structure. We think, not because it's not important, but it is somewhat separate to the economic framework. We tried to stay with, as best as we could, with things that were objective and factual, and governance is hard to make objective and factual in some ways. So I would characterize the recommendations as not prescriptive, but rather a framework. And we try to illustrate is in a general framework, there's a solution to this set of problems, and a solution that allows you to preserve a defined benefit plan, but it requires some additional revenues. We think it best comes from all participants. We think debt's an important feature. That's the primary conclusion. The secondary set of issues are, what do we need to do to make sure that kind of investment is sufficiently secure as prudent fiduciaries of not just this billion, but all the billions that go into this fund. And I think that's when you get into the governance issues and investment authority. I think governance is crucial to any organization, and I think it needs to be very closely scrutinized. There was a bill that Mr. Hanford referred to last year about changing that, and I think having a thorough adult conversation around what constitutes best-in-class governance practices is really important to that, because it's not unlike governance matters. It matters to you, and because you are fiduciaries of a very large sum of money, and you're accountable to outcomes. It's not different for pension funds.
Greg. Greg.
Steve, in this discussion, have you had an opportunity to talk to any of the rating agencies to see if other cities have done this, or how we would be perceived? And if you haven't, would you recommend that this committee look at that?
Answer are no and yes. We've begun conversations or reaching out to Fitch and Moody's on this, but not to the point we have a competent understanding of that. I absolutely think that's a worthwhile conversation to have. I believe that they would take this set of recommendations, as they frankly would the MSP, and say it's better than what you had, and that would have a positive impact on their thinking. I think the more comprehensive solution, the more positive it is. But rather than guess, I think it's a very good idea to talk to the major rating agencies, and they're changing too, as you well know. There's pending changes to GASB, and they're rethinking what they think about the importance and the impact of pension liabilities on a city's fiscal health. So that conversation is already engaged, and I certainly would participate in whatever you decide. I said, how would you react to something along these lines? And they'll give you an answer.
And I might point out that Pew has got a lot of experience with pension bonds also. They've evaluated those around the country. And I would presume you'll have relationships with the rating agencies too, so that would be something that y'all would be willing to undertake as part of the analysis. So we're very fortunate that Pew is here. They've got such great resources that we can't do. So, other questions? Steve, I really want to thank you. I was sorry that this all went so long, because I know you have some time commitments, but this has been great, and we thank you for helping us and collaborating with us. Pew has indicated they would really like to sit down with y'all as they want to sit down with others. So what your input is
we'll look forward to every opportunity to engage with you and Pew and everybody else who wants to join together to solve this very important problem. Thank you for all your attention. I appreciate the time.
Great. Thank you. Great. Other comments, questions? I'm at Roman numeral 5 on the agenda. I don't think we want to get into the weeds too much here, because I want to lay out a schedule for us and a program of work. But does anyone have any observations about what we've heard so far that they'd like to share on a global sort of basis?
Yeah, I have one comment, and I know that the recommendation of the Civic Council was the 7% assumed rate of return, with which I agree. But I agree for different reasons. And the reason is, if you are the pension fund, and if you have an assumption that you're supposed to earn 8.5%, that's going to drive you to make more risky investments. And if you, by reducing that rate down to 7%, it will drive you to make less risky investments. That, to me, is the most important part of that. Ultimately, the city guarantees that we guarantee to pay the benefits to our employees. We don't guarantee the 7% return. I disagree with that. We're guaranteeing that return. That's just what we're using to calculate, but that return drives significantly what the pension fund has as a target. And the higher that rate is, they change their strategic allocation. In order to achieve that, they make more risky investments. With more risky investments, when the market downturns, they can't achieve it, and you have this big drop-off. To me, that's the important part of not having too high a rate of assumed return, because it drives the pension fund to make decisions that is not in the best long-term interest of the plan.
I know you mentioned that we don't want to get in the weeds here today, and that Pew will take the opportunity to kind of take all of these recommendations or observations that have been made. Will we then get to see the details relative to each one of these ideas so that we can kind of assess what that means to, funding the unfunding liabilities going
Absolutely.
forward? Okay.
And Pew also said if they're open to y'all communicating with them. We can't go two of us and talk to them together because that's a sunshine law violation.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about it in a minute. But if you want to call them, they'd be more than willing to talk with you about any concerns, suggestions, observations.
Okay.
But where two or three are gathered together, so is the Times Union. So,
very good.
Any further discussion now, and we go into calendar. Charlie?
Are we going to talk about maybe how we operate?
Sure.
A question I have, and I understand the desire and the necessity for transparency in what we do. It would seem to me, for purposes of for everybody, not just this task force, but the community at large, to understand what we're doing. And this is just, I dotted this down, so if it doesn't make sense practically, somebody jump in and say, if the task force were to establish, let's say, a website, and the task force through the Pew Foundation and others, as we go through this process, we're going to determine certain facts, and we're going to also adopt certain assumptions. I think that website should have a running list of what those facts that we've determined and the assumptions we're going to use, because at the end of the day, it's the summation of those facts and assumptions which will form the basis of our recommendation. The question was asked of the Civic Council. Who was on the Civic Council and what did you consider? They went through and considered a lot of different facts and circumstances and came up with the recommendations. What we don't know is what facts they considered and what assumptions they used. We know some of that in terms of the presentation. But if we were to clearly put those out there as what we ultimately use as the facts upon which we base our recommendations and the assumption we use to get there, to me, that is the way that we more clearly can be totally transparent in how we got to where we got to.
I think you're right. There is now, Dave DeCamp, we already are on the city's website, correct?
Yes.
And you're putting everything we do in terms of the presentations, they all go on the website. We probably need to publicize that more, and I'd ask the folks in the press to help us do that. When we get to where we're adopting the assumptions we want to adopt and the recommendations as we go along, those will go on there. And Pew needs to listen to that too, because we need to do this in a framework. For example, Pew's going to come back in about a month and say, this is what we've analyzed, the current city plan, the mayor's proposal, the civic council proposal. This is what our tentative analysis reflects. And they're going to report that to us. And so presumably we will have a meeting about that, and then we'll make some judgments about it. And then that will be on the website.
Yeah, and that I think is down the road.
Right.
Up from that. I mean, for example, all of us have heard from people we know around the city, why don't you do this, why don't you do that? And it's been stated in a number of occasions, that you cannot change vested and accrued benefits for existing employees. I mean, that's a fact upon which a lot of people don't really fully understand, number one, but you in fact can change future accrual of benefits for existing employees. I mean, those types of things that I think that we have a, hopefully not voluminous, but some list of very specific facts that we believe is important to direct us to a conclusion. That's simply one of those. And that way, we can all go back and refer to those, and each of the committee members could maybe perhaps present what we believe to be a fact to you, because we can't talk about it outside of this. And that could be vetted to determine, number one, is it factual? Because we may misunderstand it. And if it is factual, and if it's important in our deliberation and reaching our ultimate conclusions, it needs to be included. If it doesn't meet those two criteria, let's don't mess it up with a bunch of stuff. But to me, that's a way to sort of help people understand how we got from point A to point D or F.
I'm hoping you don't want your chairman to get down in the weeds of this. I don't have any staff. But I hear that, and I think we do need to get a way to get this out. And so assumptions like, we could say now, we understand that you cannot change the vested benefits that are in place, and you cannot change the benefits of existing retirees, if that is truly the legal case. We could say that right now.
That's my understanding.
Right.
And that would be a fact I think is important.
Right. So,
Bill, if we do that, going back to Carl's point, I think it's really important, the narrative piece of this. How did we get here? So I don't think most of us understand it, but if you look at the JCCI report, they say pretty boldly that until 1991, we were funding, what we were supposed to. And then we took a 13-year hiatus. And we look so different than everywhere else in Florida. I think if we're going to do this, those little narrative points are really important so that folks don't think we just woke up today and we found ourselves in this place.
let me just ask, would some of y'all be willing to work on these narratives as subcommittees? Would any of you? Would you be willing for me to call you and ask you if you're not willing to volunteer now?
We'll take your.
Okay, you won't take my calls. And I'll have to ask on the Sunshine Law whether my calling to ask you to serve on a particular subcommittee, whether I can do that without, I have to find out about that. We're going to have a Sunshine Law thing in a minute. So I'm assuming y'all would be willing to do that. Ted?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, what has happened, what brought us here, and I think the JCCI study addresses that. One of the other things, though, I think that is important to look at the same time is what happened to employee compensation during that same period of time. And I had taken some of the collective bargaining agreements for that period of time, and I'd be happy to share those. But looking at them, it appears that for that 20-year period, the raises were really quite minimal for police. And instead, you were giving, essentially, you were enhancing the pension instead of giving raises. And I think that's an important part of the narrative, because when you look at it, you had the city saying to your employees, listen, we're not going to give you any more money, but we're going to enhance your pension benefit, and at the same time not putting any money into the pension, which is a great deal for the politicians, because you could please everybody. But it was, and in truth, everybody involved should have stood up and said, hey, this is not going to work long term, but none of us did. But I think that's part of the narrative too, and I think that when we look at all these things, just getting back to the point I made before, we've got to look at this as not just a pension as some type of strange animal that exists on the city budget. It's part of compensation, and if we are too aggressive in trying to take away pension benefits, that's all great, but in the short term, and we could say that we fixed the problem, but the reality is we're going to pay more in compensation and other types as we go forward. You can't hope to hire college-educated persons for a very difficult job and not pay them a market rate. So I think it's a complex issue, and I think that there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Yeah, Bob?
Should we think about a compensation study as we're doing this to see overall what that market should look like?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that I think the best thing that was interesting, the Times Union did the one study comparing the pension benefits with other cities. But I think it would be interesting to look at compensation with other comparable cities as well, because if we, I mean, that's a real, and the other thing is too, I mean, frankly, when you've got, a pension act sort of as a golden handcuffs, if you've got a bad year and the city can't pay you a raise this year, you're not going to leave because you've got the pension on the back end, And what does that do to the ability to hold your employees in place if you're not giving raises, and if you no longer have an attractive pension?
Mr. Belton, y'all have done compensation studies as y'all have gone through negotiations with the collective bargaining, is that right?
We actually are about to do that now. We're looking at compensation studies. That was a conversation this morning.
And how long would that take?
I don't want to mislead you. I can't answer that right now.
But that, as it related to police and fire, surely, I mean, the sheriff and the fire chief have said they are losing employees, so surely they understand the compensation. So could you undertake to get us what information about comparative statistics on, and break it out in the different components of compensation?
We see that now. We have that not just with police and fire, but we see it with just employees in general, and that the comparable numbers, we think we've got an issue there, so we're doing something like that.
Okay. So I don't want to pin you down on time, but as soon as reasonably possible, you could get that to us and to Pew.
So what's our defined scope? I mean, are there opportunities, like you mentioned, doing a comp study, looking at the total benefit package in general? I understand that the city is fully insured and not self-insured. Are there opportunities that we can look at that would offer savings that we can, then transfer? I mean, I don't know what our ability to
John
scope
Malott
that.
gave us some good advice. We need to remember our focus.
Right.
And if we get way out on this, we're going to be.
And that's what I.
I
that's
think
what
we
I mean.
need to focus on the
where we
police
really
and fire
wanna
pension
focus
fund,
is-
knowing
Right.
in the larger context that it will have compensation impacts.
Right.
Or retention and hiring impacts.
Exactly.
I think
Okay.
that's.
And Mr. Chairman, if we're looking at compensation comparisons, which we should we also look at the ratio of compensation to define benefits in those comparable situations? Because we can't look at one in a vacuum and then try to analyze what the benefits should be here to offset whatever compensation deficiencies there might be until we know what the ratios look like in other comparable communities.
I just want us to remember we've got a very specific task and we're going to be here forever. But Jonathan or David, do y'all have some capacity to do some comparisons with other cities and within the state who we compete with? And
we can do that on the pension side. Getting the compensation side gets a little outside of scope, but we'll certainly do our best. But the pension side is more in what we're
okay, good, great. Other observations? Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, due to the circular nature and the sensitivity of that, if you do reduce benefits and that causes you to have to raise your compensation 2 or 3%, then a lot of the assumptions that we're going to make are just not going to hold up.
Well, like Steve said. Right, sure.
Well, and technically, if compensation is increased, so are pension benefits,
That's
because
right.
they're based upon compensation.
That's right.
This should be easy.
Greg?
I just want to make sure that that we talk about the framework. We spent a lot of time today talking about investments and potential ways to lower the liability, and that's process. That's stuff that we can really affect in more of a direct way. But what I would suggest from my vast 2 years experience on city council is that we need to keep in mind that the benefits themselves are negotiated benefits. We're talking about labor union negotiations. So anytime we talk about raising benefits, lowering benefits, this is something that we've probably got to wrap it, a different strategy, and probably be very closely working with the administration on.
That's right, both the administration and I want to, in this big, thick booklet we have, there are a couple of things I just want to call to your attention. And I've done it every meeting, and Greg is right on. C1 is the 30-year agreement. And that is a real agreement. We are not the federal district judge who's going to adjudicate whether that is valid or invalid, which is the subject of that litigation. So that means if we want to make a grand proposal, if we don't want to wait 3 years for some federal judge to say we can or cannot do it, we've got to negotiate that with Bobby and with John and with the city council and with the mayor. And so I've always seen this as a mediation within a mediation in the public, which makes it even harder. So that 30-year agreement, y'all should read and reread. That's C1. Item 4A4 is the Pension Transition Committee report. That's a very important report to read to give you a baseline. I've already told you about number 8 and number 9 of A. Those are important. As background, the JCCI City Finances report is very helpful. And the Civic Council retirement letter at the very end, D2. I also highlighted A4, excuse me. Let's see. A3 is the summary of a bill before the council in 2011 that didn't proceed, but the left-hand column of that shows what our existing plan does. I think you don't need to worry about the right-hand column, but the left-hand column says here's where we are, and that puts it in a bullet point place. John?
Mr. Chairman, if I might add, the Payton administration put together a transition report on their way out when the Brown administration was coming in, and it was a very good analysis of how we got here, and I think it's important to have that history so we know how to avoid getting here again.
Great.
And I think we want to play a role in that.
I don't see who's back there. Is Chris still here? Carol, would you see that you can get maybe circulated within the next couple of days that report? I think that'd be helpful. Great. Okay, and here's, if we can sort of segue now into where we go. I've sort of laid out tentatively, knowing that we all have very difficult schedules. I've vetted this not specifically, but generally with Pew, and they're happy with this, subject to some extraordinary event or something. But what I want to propose is the week of October 21st, that would be either Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. We have another probably afternoon meeting at which Pew would report to us their analysis of the existing plan, the Civic Council plan, the mayor, left something out. The existing plan, the mayor's plan, and Civic Council plan, and also some of what you've heard, but this is really in the focus at the moment, maybe some observations on the 30-year agreement. Sort of a baseline of here we are. Mm-hmm. So of that week, are there any particular dates? I would prefer it earlier in the week rather than later in the week. And but y'all tell me, just to throw something out. Tuesday the 22nd.
I'm not available that whole week.
That whole week. Well, great. You can be the chairman of the subcommittee and submit your report. Okay. How about anybody? Is the week good for everybody else, knowing that we're going to have?
I'm out that week.
You're out that week too. Okay.
Few is commitments on Thursday and Friday that week, just to clarify our.
Okay.
This might be a good meeting for Halloween. It's sufficiently scary enough.
Well, let's see now. I've got this iPad that downloaded a new way of doing things yesterday, and there you go. How do you change your month? There it is.
Just swipe it.
Yep. I'm doing that. Well, anyway, I'll go back to the iPhone. What about, I'll be in Atlanta on the 28th. What about the 29th? Tuesday, the 29th. Tuesday, the 29th, okay? 1 to 5? Or would you rather have a morning meeting or an afternoon meeting?
Would morning work?
Morning.
Morning, 9 to 12. So this would be the 29th, 9 to 12. Okay. The next thing I want to propose is that the week of November 4th, again, earlier in the week would be better, either the 4th or the 5th. What I want to propose is that we have a town meeting sort of thing where anybody that wants to make a presentation, short presentation to the committee that has suggestions, so that we get the community input, can come, and so we need to have a lengthy enough period of time to cover that. I would hope we could get a process where people would sign up in advance. But I'd like to suggest that probably the best for the public would be something like 5 to 8 or 5 to 7. How about the 5th of November from 5 to 8? Make the commitment to 8 and hope we don't. Now that's the city council night, so it's not. Oh, okay, is that all right?
It's also election day.
It's what?
It's election day according to my calendar, if that matters.
Not this year.
It is, someplace it is.
Yeah, not here. Okay, so the second meeting would be November the 5th from 5 to 8 for a town meeting sort of thing, which we'll organize. The third meeting I want to propose is the week of December the 2nd, which is the week after Thanksgiving. And everyone is going to be fully stuffed on Monday, so I want to propose we not meet on Monday the 2nd. So I would suggest the 3rd, 4th, or 5th. And that would be a meeting like this where Pew then would be making a report to us, analyzing everything that they'd heard so that we could understand from their perspective what was good and what was bad. Any Tuesday the 3rd, how does that sound? 9 to 12, Tuesday the 3rd. Is there another day during the week? The 5th, David said end of the week is bad for y'all. Is the Thursday, the 5th of December okay there?
I think so.
I can do 3rd or 4th, but not the 5th.
Not the 5th, okay. Okay. All right, I'll throw, who would rather have the 3rd or the 5th? Leave it up to y'all. Doesn't matter? Any chance of either of you changing your calendars for one day or the other? Okay.
I can't do it on the 3rd, not that it matters, but I'll just let you know that's committee week. So if you're trying to use the chambers, you won't be able to use the chambers.
Okay. Oh, so the 3rd, you would be out too. So the 5th from 9 to 12, December the 5th, 9 to 12. Okay?
I could, never mind. I can't do it on that, either morning or afternoon. Okay.
Okay. All right, and then the next meeting I want to propose, we don't have January here, but I want to propose the week of January the 5th. Excuse me, week of January the 6th. And either the 7th or 8th. Again, 9 to 12 seems to be the best. January.
The 8th,
January.
I think the 6th and the 7th may be committee.
Okay, January the 8th from 9 to 12. January 8, 9 to 12. And then the final, and that one, that would be where Pew and we are beginning to, we're now focusing in on particular recommendations and options and that sort of thing. And then, so that they then have, that's really a big day for us. That's a big decision day because we're going to be making some decisions. And then on the week of January 20th, that'd be the 21st, 22nd, or 23rd.
I could only do 20 or 21st.
All right.
Let's go 21st.
21st, 9 to 12.
And again, that's, you're going to run into committee week, so if you're going to use council chambers.
I don't think we'd use the chambers. We wouldn't. I'd feel uncomfortable sitting. Okay. All right, so January the 21st from 9 to 12, and we'll look to that to be our final meeting unless we really are unable to do it by then.
That's the final meeting?
That's the final meeting.
You want to do it in the afternoon?
Can y'all do it in the afternoon on that meeting? January 21st from 1 to, let's say 1 to 5.
That's better.
That's the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
One to 5 p.m. And that may not take that long because hopefully by the prior meeting, Pew would have heard what we want to do. We will have formed our report so that this is really tweaking it. And unless we're really in disagreement at that point, we should be in the position to turn it loose. And we would deliver the report after that meeting. Does that sound like a good time frame for y'all? Okay. That is ambitious.
Have her email those to us.
Yes. Sure. Okay, great. From the administration's perspective, those dates work? Pew, those all work? Who else do I need to ask? Bobby, y'all have been big support, so we want y'all to be able to be here too. So I think that's everybody.
Ronnie.
Yes, Ronnie.
So just my notes, so we got October 29th, November 5th, December 5th, January 8th, and January 21st.
Correct.
That's right.
And the 21st is kind of like the reporting date. The work is going to be done by the end of the meeting on the 6th.
Right, and hopefully we will have a great idea of where we are on the 6th, because Pew will have already reported to us once. And then, right. Okay, any other, well, we have a little bit more business. We really need to remind ourselves about the Sunshine Law, and we have representatives from the General Counsel's office. Ms. Lambert is going to tell us about the Sunshine Law. Again.
Good afternoon. I understand many of you have served on public boards and commissions before. Some of you do it for your living, so I won't get too much into the weeds with this one. I just want to remind you that the entire decision-making process of this board needs to take place at publicly noticed, properly noticed public meetings where minutes are taken. The things that public boards do that freak out the public are those perfunctory meetings where it looks like all of the decisions have already been made and the board seems to rubber stamp things. You guys are not doing that. The discussions that you're having are the kind of things that kill the conspiracy theory, so thank you for that. Also, thank you for not screwing around on your phones and iPads during the meeting. That also really irritates the public and the press. So keep doing that. As a matter of practicality, all of your correspondence that you receive in connection with this board, whether you are a public employee or not, is subject to public disclosure. For the sake of your own sanity, please either do this manually or have the person who handles your correspondence for you create a folder in your email account, whatever email account that you use to receive the correspondence related to this board. have a folder set aside specifically for this task force so that if you receive a records request for all of the correspondence that you make or receive related to this board, just have it all set aside so that you can throw it on a thumb drive, or just have it set aside and hit forward on all however many emails and get them out the door, just so that you can do it and be done with it and not have to tear your hair out at 3 o'clock in the morning, as sometimes happens to normal people who just happen to volunteer for a public board. Another thing worth, yes.
Let me just add something there. What I often forget to do is to copy myself on what I send. So when you send an email related to this, just make a copy for yourself. Then you've got a copy that you can put right into that folder.
Right.
Okay. Sorry.
No, by all means. There's little things you can do to help keep your digital paper trail in order that will save you a lot of time, hassle, and stress when you do get a records request. If you do save it, you won't get a request. If you don't save it, you will, and you'll freak out later. A statute that has recently been enacted is 286.0114. It was Senate Bill 50. It's the statutory right of the public to comment at public meetings. You guys have always been letting the public comment at all of the meetings that you've held thus far. The statute technically takes effect on October 1st, but since you all have a very healthy understanding that this is a matter of great public concern, and just for the overall good karma factor, you've been allowing the public to comment at every meeting, it would be very smart for you to adopt rules of engagement for public comment, which you are allowed to do under the statute. The city council rule is 3 minutes a pop. I've been timing the people who've been commenting at prior public meetings. No one's taken up more than 1:40 anyway. You're allowed to adopt for rules for time. You're allowed to regulate for relevancy and poor conduct. No one has been rude or inappropriate thus far. Fingers crossed. Everyone's been pretty cool. I don't think it's going to be an issue.
Right.
So keep on doing what you're doing. You do not have to ignore each other in public. You do not need to sever any pre-existing social relationships with one another. If you run into each other at the Gator game or in Tallahassee, you do not need to put on blinders and walk away from each other. You just need to not discuss the business of this board outside meetings of this board. And God knows you all have other things to discuss, yes? Questions for me? Y'all have a good one.
Thank you very much, Alexis. That leads to the next item, adoption task force rules. What I would like to propose is in our public comment period, we adopt a rule of each person has 3 minutes to talk. And I don't think we need anything else at this point, but we do need to do that. And that's going to be statutory.
You do want them to identify themselves.
Yes, identify themselves and their address, I suppose. Okay. See, city council experience really helps around here. Okay, so I'd like to entertain a motion that when someone speaks, they identify themselves, their address,
3 minutes.
and they're limited to 3 minutes. Second?
Second.
Dr. Rupp made that motion, and Mr. Shercliffe seconded it. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed. Thank you. And with that, we now move to our public comment period. Before we do that, I have just passed around to you a sheet which I asked Mr. Belton to give me. What this shows you is the ad valorem tax levy that was actually made from 2000 to 2012 in terms of millage rates. And if you'll look, we started dropping the rate. And the right-hand set of columns shows what they would have been in thousands had we kept the millage rate the same all those years. For example, I think this is right, in the difference in 2001 from 2000, we would have had another $5,927,000 had we just kept the millage rate the same. Interestingly, in 2008, we would have had $125 million. That is amazing. $125,728,000 had we kept the millage rate the same. $124 million in 2009, and this past year we would have had another $33,710,000. I think that's instructive to. I think the public is now recognizing that we've been going on the cheap for a long time, And I think the community is starting to talk about, well, Greg, we think it'd be great if you really do consider as the city council. We don't want to be on the cheap anymore. So I hope this is helpful as we think about our deliberations about what we do with either dedication of millage rates or recommendations on keeping them. The other paper that we didn't talk about on your desk is the remarks that David Drain from Pew made last Monday, which you could review. They were very helpful. So, let me ask before we go to the public, David, Jonathan, and I did not introduce, and I've lost my notes here. Jonathan Trichter, some of y'all have met. David Train, you've met. And new to us is Michelle Evermore. Michelle and David work out of D.C., although David lives in Ann Arbor. Jonathan works out of New York, and we are glad that y'all are here. Any response, observation, anything y'all want to make?
I think we really appreciate both this invitation to work with the task force and with stakeholders in Jacksonville. I think we're very impressed by the thoughtfulness of both the task force and the mayor's office and the Civic Commission in their comments on this. And we hope to come up with something that's going to be responsive to the mayor's office, the police and pension fund, the city council. It's going to be a fair and data-driven approach, and it's going to give retirement security to workers and cost certainty and affordability and sustainability.
That's great. David's been working in pensions, you told me, 7-8 years. Michelle for over 11 years, both on the Hill and otherwise. And Jonathan is a corporate and public pension turnaround, rescue, whatever you want to call. And so they bring vast experience to it. And I do really want to emphasize the nonpartisan nature of what Pew does. They do not have an agenda, and they just want to do for Jacksonville is what all of us can determine to be what's best for Jacksonville. That can be negotiated within the constraints of our legal setting. So, the podium is open for public comment. And I suppose at some point we ought to have some place for people to sign in ahead of time. We'll do that next meeting. So would anyone like to address the committee? Yes, sir.
I have a handout. I don't have quite enough. Maybe you can make some further copies. My talk is not really going to talk about the handout. My name is Curtis Lee. I live in Jacksonville. I began doing pension work.
Do you have an address in Jacksonville?
Yes, 7537 T-Ticket Court.
Thank you.
I'm a retired attorney. I graduated from law school, NYU, in 1980. I started work for a company in Buffalo, New York, named National Fuel Gas shortly thereafter. 1981, I started doing a lot of pension work. They had a defined benefit corporate pension plan. After doing a variety of work, it wasn't all pension, corporate, and so on, I was promoted to a title called General Manager Finance, which I held for many years. And one of my duties there was to manage the pension fund at National Fuel. At the time I left, it had about $500 million. So I had about 17 or 18 years of dealing with actuaries and a lot of time dealing with issues such as assumed rates of return and all the other issues that go along with defined benefit pension plans. After retiring and moving down here, I started following the Police and Fire Pension Fund beginning 4 years ago. And I immediately recognized several things, that basically it's in serious financial trouble, and also that it's very badly run, in my opinion. And further, a big problem is what, in my view, are excessive benefits and excessively early retirements. The average Police and Fire Pension Fund beneficiary retires at 49 and gets $53,000 a year currently. That's really not sustainable. The big problem is that the average person now will be retired longer than they worked, And further, that compared to the average salary in Jacksonville, which is about $38,000 a year, there's a big injustice that retirees are making more than people who are working and paying the property taxes for those retirees. So again, it's unsustainable. Personally, I would be biased towards transitioning towards a defined contribution plan approach, or at least towards a hybrid such as the cash balance plans. Yes?
1 minute. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, but at any rate, the handout shows why you should be very careful about handing $1 billion to the Police and Fire Pension Fund. It's a scandal-infused entity. They cannot be trusted with $1 billion. Secondly, even if the PFPF were a better entity, still it's a bad idea. The $1.7 billion in UAAL is actually $1.5 billion if you use the more reasonable 7 3/4 rate, and it's under $1 billion if you use a higher rate like 9%. And going back to the issue of the rate of return, in the 80s and 90s, I would hear a lot of people talking about, oh, things are going well, we ought to assume over 10%. And I was always skeptical of that. Don't panic towards going down to 7%. 7 3/4 was what FRS uses. 8 and above is the long run history, the 30-year history of the pension world. Stay with 7 3/4 and don't buy into the 7%. It costs taxpayers a lot of money. I will be happy to talk with you further, but if I'm running out of time now, please keep me in mind. My phone number's on there. My email address is on there. I'm an eminence grise in this field, and I would hope you would be calling me with questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Anyone from the press? Have we asked every question y'all want to ask? Anybody have a question that we haven't asked that you'd like to ask? Okay, any other business to come before the task force? Thank y'all for your commitment. This has been a longer afternoon than I thought it would be, but grateful. The community is grateful for your service. Thank you.